Welcome back to Perspectives on Human Communication and an overview of relational dialectics theory. RDT is a fascinating theory in part just because it's so different from the other theories that we've talked about that deal with interpersonal communication. If you look in the book, it's clear that this theory emerges in the critical theories portion of the book, so it's in the later chapters. And what that means is they're challenging assumptions of previous theories that came before them, theories from the socio-psych tradition, and even to some extent from the interpretive, the general interpretive tradition, although the critical tradition does really position within the interpretive tradition as a whole. So relational dialectics is all about relationships as indeterminate, complex processes that involve tensions, pulls and pushes and pulls, back and forth tensions. And so that's what this theory is about. This is going to be a quick overview. We're not going to get into the individual tensions. We'll hold that for class, but be sure to read about those and then we'll apply them in class. So the push me, pull you concept in this theory, really, in a nutshell, is all about contradiction. And Baxter and Montgomery, who authored this theory and wrote a book about it, define it as the dynamic interplay between unified oppositions. And this is the heart of relational dialectics. And so dynamic is important because it's something that is constantly in flux. It's constantly being negotiated. And a contradiction means that you hold two things inside of you at the same time, and it's constantly moving back and forth, and you're negotiating that. And so each of the tensions that they'll describe and the authors describe in the book, you hold both of those inside of you. You know, in any relationship, for instance, in any relationship, you have a desire to be connected to that person, but you also have a desire for independence. And so that independence, interdependence, or connectedness, separateness dialectic, you have both of those inside of you at the same time, and it's that interplay between those, what they call unified oppositions. So they're unified in the sense that they're both about the same thing, connection. But sometimes you want more and sometimes you want less, and you're constantly negotiating that. So contradiction is a key concept in this theory. There is another theory that we didn't look at. It's in your book called cognitive dissonance theory. And this theory really involves some of that cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance, and sometimes we hold dissonant or contradictory ideas. Well, this is the same thing that this theory is getting at. Every relationship, they say, faces that tension between intimacy and independence. And we are constantly having to think about and reconcile those conflicting desires. So that's the heart of this theory. From a relational dialectics perspective, Baxter and Montgomery say bonding occurs in both. It occurs both in that desire for interdependence and the desire for independence from the other person. And we can experience different kinds of bonding and maybe even an increase in our bonding at both sides of that tension. So they offer three different perspectives on this, the notion of a dialectic, or the notion of these concepts that reside within a dialectic. So one way of thinking about our relational lives is monologic, and that is that we're either connected or we're separate. We're either interdependent or we're independent. We're either open or we're closed. And so you can kind of inhabit that either or mentality. And so if you are not feeling close to somebody, you're feeling distant, you feel like you're all that. You know, you're just not close, or you're distant, or you're entirely being smothered and you're very close. And they suggest that the older kinds of theories sort of use that mentality, that conceptual logic, that you're either one thing. You know, so for instance, think back to the symbolic interactionism or social penetration theory, and this idea, especially in social pen, that you're either progressing in intimacy or you're depenetrating and you're digressing in that intimacy. You're doing one or the other. That would be more of a monologic approach to that. A second way of thinking about the tensions is dualistic. You know, so we used to, at the early part or stages of our relationship, we were kind of separate. And you would compare separateness from the early stage of the relationship to the middle stage to where you are now. And again, thinking about social pen, that's kind of the progression or the evolution of a relationship that theory imagines. So you are always comparing these opposite categories of separateness. And we used to be more separate, and now we're more close. And so our intimacy has gone from this level to this level. So that's a second way of like thinking of these things as categories, and I think about them separately, dualistic. They operate maybe at the same time, but they're different categories of something. The dialectic says no, those things work together, and you're constantly negotiating the tension between these contradictory poles in your life. So that the dialectic theory really is a different way of thinking about it, and as you'll see, of dealing with those tensions, because monologic and dualistic mindsets would have completely different ways of thinking about and dealing with those tensions. So there's a couple of things about dialectics that we want to lay down as a framework and a foundation for when we're going to talk about these dialectics. One is the totality of the dialectic, that each dialectic that we're talking about represents an interdependent, holistic relational dimension. And we can't separate things out. We can't talk about one thing without thinking about the other, considering the other, because they are completely connected in the totality of a relationship, or the relationship with a community, right? A couple, for instance, and their position within a community. Secondly, this notion of contradiction, that we constantly live amidst lots of contradictions, things that pull on us in different directions. And it's the interplay of those oppositions that's interesting and that we live within, right? We can't step outside of these things. And so some research talks about centripetal pushes and pulls and centrifugal pushes and pulls. And what that means is there are some things that pull us toward each other, and there's some things that push us away from each other. So that centripetal are factors that bring us together. Centrifugal are factors that push us apart and away from each other. And then the notion of motion, the idea that our relationships are constantly in a process of change. That's the dynamic aspect of it, right? They're constantly changing over time. Relationships are not static. And there's sometimes you feel closer to a certain person, and sometimes you feel more distant. It ebbs and flows, and you sometimes are building on something, sometimes you're repairing or restoring something, sometimes you're separating and going in different ways. And so those relationships are constantly in motion. And then the actual lived out. Think of this back to the coordinated management of meaning theory. And we talked about the stories lived. That's what this notion of praxis is, that you are constantly in the process of living out and making choices in real time. And so we're in those stories lived all the time. Now, I don't want to confuse you. That concept isn't part of the dialectic theory, but sometimes I think it's helpful to sort of think about these theories and how they relate to each other. And really, praxis is an ongoing practice or working out of these tensions. And as one of the assumptions will tell us, that we as humans are choice makers, and we're making these choices in real time, either moving us toward each other or moving away from each other and negotiating those tensions. So what are the assumptions in this theory? I love little cartoons that sort of get at some of the assumptions or kind of speak to these theories. So here's a cartoon, and she's telling her stuffed animals for the evening, hey, do you guys mind if I sleep alone for a change? She's feeling a little more distant or needing some space and some independence, and so she's got to clear them off the bed. So the first assumption is that relationships are not linear, and RDT really tried to push back against previous theories on that regard, because they said most other theories suggested that we're on this ongoing increasing progression of increasing intimacy or evolution of a relationship into a deeper, closer relationship. Certainly people understood that relationships ended and there were breakups, but you were either going this way or you were going this way. And they said, no, that's not the case. We're doing both at the same time. We're constantly negotiating that. And so relationships are not linear. Relationship and life is characterized by change, that dynamic that's happening all the time. And so we need to understand that change is a commonality, is a variable that is always present, and we need to recognize it in our models, that people are constantly changing, and you can't just create these linear paths of relational life. Third, the assumption of contradiction. And here, I guess we could have a little debate and maybe a conversation in class is contradiction just a fundamental fact of life, or is it the fundamental? They state it in the text as the fundamental fact of relational life. We can debate that, and maybe we will. We'll leave that there for now, but that's a question. But contradiction, again, is a key assumption. So you've got this nonlinearity, you've got change or dynamism, and then you've got contradiction. And then the fourth assumption is that communication is how we work these things out. Communication is the mechanism that we use to negotiate our relational contradictions with our friends, with our family, with our significant others, that we're using communication. And whenever there's this concept in communication, you're either communicating or you're communicating about the way you're communicating. And that we call that meta communication, when we're communicating about the way we're communicating. And so relational dialectics is often in that realm of meta communication, where you're negotiating with people what the relationship is going to look like. Think of the DTR in a significant other relationship, where you're defining the relationship. That's often that meta level, and relational dialectics is all about that, understanding how people are doing that. Sometimes it's not explicit, we're not saying it out loud, but we're still negotiating it. But sometimes we do make that very explicit, and we actually voice those meta levels of communication. And then the fifth assumption is that we're choice makers. We are conscious, intentional choice makers, and those choices have implication for our relationships. So that's where we're going with this theory. We will dive into the specific tensions and illustrating them in class, and we'll see you there.